Okay, so for the last talk for Symposium, we have Timo, Torsten, and Schmidt, and we will talk about the systematic study of altered states of consciousness. Take it away, Timo.
Yeah, so it takes a chance that I'm co-organizing a little symposium to also schedule a talk on a topic which is maybe a bit different from the other ones before, and where you might read it and think, okay, maybe this might be the outlier talk, talking about altered states of consciousness, seeing what's to be expected there. However, I think it's fair in a symposium, which is under the subtitle New Trends in Consciousness Research, to put something in on altered states of consciousness. If at the moment you're going to some consciousness conference, there's always like little tracks on psychedelics and something in this sphere of research. So I thought to present here a bit of an overview and like suggestions for systematic study and how our consciousness research can overall benefit from this. I first wanted to show this graphic which I developed for teaching purposes at some point to illustrate or to describe the field of empirical consciousness research, as I would call it, and what people do in this field. So on the one hand, in the upper left, there's conscious versus subliminal processing. We've heard quite some experimental setups and examples from this. Perispecial stimulation, priming, masking stimuli. The question is, what are the neural correlates of stimulus awareness? Another aspect of consciousness research would be the content of consciousness, working memory, mental imagery, or the perception studies are today often framed under the term of one is studying the neural correlates of content of consciousness. So like 20 years ago, people were not using the word consciousness, now it became more woke that as a working memory researcher, you relabel yourself of saying, I'm a consciousness researcher, I'm like studying the content of consciousness. And then, of course, a bit different fields, one like levels of consciousness. So, how conscious is somebody? Clinical applications, coma, anesthesia, locked-in syndrome states are considered under this topic often, and consciousness disturbances. So, all the situations that something goes wrong in normal conscious processing, like if people are hallucinating, is having different body or self-perception, or clinical questions. And the field of altered states in consciousness research I would put there in the middle. I will define a bit more what I specifically understand among altered states, as it somehow can contribute in a very well-controlled experimental environment. Evidence or it can contribute to the clarification of the underlying neural mechanisms of symptoms which are also relevant in clinical context. So, in example, neural correlates of hallucinations could be studied in a systematic way within laboratory conditions. And there, I believe it's fair to say that it has become quite a trend. So, in the last years, particularly, hundreds of millions of dollars were invested in research in psychedelics and the potential of psychedelics to be used in treatment of mental health conditions. So there's medical interest in these altered states, particularly when it's used pharmacologically. Maybe this is just like a interesting industry effect while I was focusing there on the pharmacological induction. On the other hand, computational psychiatry was growing as a field where one wants to learn about the mechanisms which are stimulated in the moment when somebody is experiencing an altered state, which could reveal underlying mechanisms of psychopathology. And on the other hand, also philosophy of mind became quite interested in this to ask the question, well, there's such big varieties of altered states of consciousness that people can experience. Do they have something in common? Is there underlying structures of the conscious experiences that you can have, which teach us something about the scope of conscious experience that are there for humans, and thereby helping to define what we understand under the consciousness concept as such. From an empirical research perspective, one could see altered states as a tool that you can use in the laboratory in order to study NCC's neural correlates of consciousness. And this is a perspective which I would like to show in this presentation. In the first part, I will talk about the systematic study of the phenomenology of altered states of consciousness and what one can learn from them. So how can you compare an altered state that is induced by a psychedelic, an example, as compared to an altered state that you get from I don't know, alcohol, or that you get with, from a runner's high, or that you get when you're getting into a sensory deprivation tank. How can they be compared? Do they share some features? And then in the second bit, I want to show some research examples from research where one could use it in a controlled laboratory environment. But maybe I want to start off with something that Bain and Howie were pointing to in the consciousness debate in this very nice article where they were asking the question, are there levels of consciousness? And they're arguing that maybe the terminology of level of consciousness, like how conscious you are, is a problematic one. They're illustrating it here with I find quite a good example, and I'm just going to read it out, why it is maybe too simple to think about that a whole system or a person or an animal is more or less conscious or not. And this is maybe an oversimplified way of looking at it. And so what they give here as an analogy is that they refer to, well, let's talk about an economy. Can we say an economy is healthy or is unhealthy? It does not make too much sense, they are saying. They're saying it's rather economy has different dimensions and factors and features, and it can be healthy with some regards, and it can be less healthy with other regards when you are comparing different economies. I would just like to read it out. The Chinese economy might be healthier than the Brazilian economy on some dimensions, whereas the opposite might be the case when other dimensions are considered. Is there any sense in which one of these two economies is, all things considered, healthier than the other? Perhaps not. Attempts to impose an absolute ordering on global states of consciousness may be as futile as attempts to impose such an ordering on economies. So the argument is that it does not make too much sense to just speak about there's more or less consciousness, or that there's a different level of consciousness, but one needs to identify what are the different features or dimensions of consciousness with which regards there is more or less pronounced in a particular state. Then, like the question, what is this dimensions of consciousness? But it's not a new question at all. When looking at such simple classification schemes as Lorry's, it's a two-dimensional classification system for consciousness states. Along the dimensions, the content of consciousness or the awareness of the content and the level of consciousness, which is a quite famous graphic, I think, to whatever consciousness conference you go, like one person will have it on the slides, and then you have like these clinical situations that you require in this basically two-dimensional system where you define two different features of consciousness. However, Bain and Howie also in their article argue, well, two dimensions, this is too simplistic, there's more dimensions to consciousness. And one can find also there in the literature like quite nice, let's say, formalizations, like also philosophers of mind like to do it. And people speak about, we could say there is a consciousness state space. So here illustrated just like this 3 dimensions. It will be higher dimensional, maybe 10, maybe 100 different dimensions. So aspects of consciousness. And then when we want to describe in one particular moment, one particular person or organism is in a conscious state, then you are somewhere in a position in this consciousness state space along multiple dimensions which are describing consciousness. So one could define them that over a normal day, we are not always in the same type of conscious state. There's a trajectory. Maybe in the morning we are very drowsy. And if one of the dimensions would be drowsiness, then over the day we would change the position in the state space because our drowsiness or wakefulness level is changing. So one could thereby define such trajectories which are in somehow parts of this consciousness space which are considered, let's say, healthy, or if you're just going for a probabilistic view, you could say like, well, in some parts of this consciousness space, this is where you are normally at. You're having like a high probability to be there because this is a normal fluctuations that you have every day. And this is helping to somehow trying to define the concept of an altered state of consciousness, where one could maybe be thrown out of the normal zone where your normal average consciousness state is, by a particular method, or in example by taking psychedelics, and then you are somewhere in the state space where you experience hallucinations, so your body perception is changing and so on, and then this would be some of the psychedelic subspace in the consciousness state space. So this is how one could formally define or describe the question of research that quite some people formulate in this altered states research sphere to find out how should we name these dimensions and how should we define the consciousness state space. We were recently looking in a review article in how people are referring to this, and it's like often in the history of science, many people are referring to the same thing, but everybody's using different words. So if you ask the authors, they will say they refer to maybe slightly different things, but there's like all of these different terms basically referring to what I was now calling dimensions. Other people call it properties or aspects, facets, characteristics, structures, subsystems or divisions, features or domains of consciousness. And basically, I guess one can formalize it in such a state space approach. And the question and the debate and how you were formulating it would be, what are those, how to identify those? And in this talk, I would like to argue that it is a very interesting question, a conceptual question for philosophy of mind, to see what is such invariant structures or independent dimensions that one might find, which are spanning the consciousness state space. And then for neuroscience, the question would be to identify corresponding neural mechanisms or neural correlates of these particular dimensions. So that it's not about the general description of how conscious the system is, but what is the neural correlate of the awareness, or what is the neural correlate of a specific content representation or of an hallucination, and so on. And therefore, the argument here would be that it might be very much worth it to look at all of these varieties of altered state experiences that people can have to learn the dimensionality of the state space, to then look for useful neural correlates in consciousness, or like really informative neural correlates, and not just for how conscious the organism is in some moment. And one way to get there would be to use altered states in the laboratory, systematically induce alterations in consciousness. And one can, however, learn there quite a bit from history. So maybe first, also from this review article that we put together, I like to call them altered states of consciousness because it's a not normative statement, so it doesn't say it's a higher state of consciousness or lower state, it's just like altered. Other people call them modified states, non-ordinary states, pattern of phenomenological properties are changing, exceptional states, modulated states, expanded states, higher states, entropic states, exalted states, mystical states. Some of them refer to particular types of states, other terms having like this general reference. And when looking through literature, like I don't want to provide my own definitions, I just want to say how people try to define this literature. Of course, when you say altered, you have the challenge like, okay, what is normal? But the state-space approach gave us already like a bit of an idea that one could say, okay, everything that is for you subjectively noticeable, strongly divergent from your average consciousness state, which you are used to from everyday life, could be called an altered state. In order to be significantly divergent from what you usually experience, it needs to be short-lasting, so it needs to be transient. This is what many authors use as a criterion to distinguish them from the states that you have in psychopathology, which are longer-lasting. So one is typically here referring to short-lasting experiences. And then authors refer to it has to affect multiple aspects of consciousness. As if it's only one aspect of consciousness, then well, you say you're in a higher arousal state or in a lower arousal state, but maybe you don't want to call it an altered state. That's just the definitions which are there. And then how to get there, how to induce those states. This is where the fun part starts. People refer to consciousness modifying techniques or like induction methods of altered states. We were looking a bit what could one do in the laboratory as well, or what is available, typical distinction between pharmacological methods and non-pharmacological methods. And then, of course, one has to consider which of those are, on the one hand, safe for people to like apply in the lab, and which of those are suited for the laboratory environment. The list of pharmacological ones is like super long, and I guess there's famous things in everybody knows all about like if it's starting with alcohol, if it's cannabis, if it's LSD, DMT, ayahuasca, what now people talk more about. Maybe one has seen such lists before. I particularly found methods which are not using pharmacological manipulations particularly interesting. We also try to compile lists here that people talk about, such techniques like sensory deprivation. You're going into a floating tank, you're like swimming in body temperature warm water, you don't get feedback from your body, it's complete darkness, and you have earplugs in, and under such a condition of sensory deprivation, suddenly people experience very strong alternate experiences, out-of-body experiences, they feel dissolved from the universe. Quite fascinating that you can get such states. This has some similarities to psychedelic states, or like where you put stimulant for neurotransmitters, or like for trigger mechanism in the brain, and you can also get this just like from depriving somebody with feedback from the senses. And this is what I found particularly interesting, to then also make the comparison between these states and like think about what can we learn from, that there's different mechanisms which might lead to the same phenomena. And this brings us back to the idea of that there's underlying dimensions or underlying structures in conscious experiences, which one could maybe find out by comparing what type of subjective experiences do you get from pharmacological changes, and what type of experiences are you getting from non-pharmacological ones, what do they have in common, and how do they differ? And probably what they have in common is like mapping onto similar brain mechanisms, which are just stimulated by very different ways. You can stimulate a hallucination by sensory deprivation or by taking a psychedelic. So this should inform us about what our brain is generally able to generate hallucinations. But the neural correlate is probably not the 5-HT2A receptor activation. It's maybe not a useful correlate, but it must be some computational mechanism which can be stimulated in different ways. And this is, I think, quite interesting to investigate, and is in this field of altered states research then a central question: what could be such underlying dimensions or structures or features of altered states be? And these might inform us overall about underlying structures of human consciousness and ultimately of the neural correlates of those. When talking about this topic, I so many times was told by people, yeah, but Timo, people in the 70s thought already about this a lot, and like you just didn't do your reading, like this is all out in the literature, people were thinking about it. So finally, I was very happy that Larry Ford from Liège was like now putting the effort to do a huge literature review across all classification systems for altered states of consciousness, which were proposed in the literature, to find out what people suggest as dimensions or as features of altered states that one could look at. This is an article which is the longest manuscript ever, I think 90 pages, almost a book, where each of these classification schemes is shortly described. And here just one very simple, also two-dimensional example, like from Ralph Metzner, who would then put different types of induction methods for different types of states on a hedonia and arousal spectrum. So again, we would agree it's a bit oversimplified because he's only looking at two dimensions. Other people are extending this, then here, hey, it's three dimensions. In this case, time, affect, and awareness. And then dropping this on already such a spatial arrangement, a suggestion for such a state-space approach. So Larry Ford was going through all of these classification schemes and was trying to extract all of the suggestions that are made for such basic classification dimensions. And in the end, it was clustering all of those terms which are around and suggested. And one could see the result of this as pointing in the direction where people agree on basic underlying shared structures of altered states, where here illustrated with these word clouds. There's an imagery perception cluster, the body image cluster, self-boundaries are changed or altered, significance or mystical or religious experience cluster, arousal, sense of time, emotion, and then a big collective cluster. I mean, emotions was a big collective cluster for all kinds of emotion, and cognitive control also like a big collective cluster for all type of cognitive features which are described in the model. So, of course, this is just narrative literature review and like putting together what people have suggested, but it's somehow like a good overview what smart people, much smarter than us, who were just like collecting this, were putting thought into it to suggest the core features of consciousness. And in this way, one could say here, okay, let's make it an 8-dimensional state space, just as a suggestion. This is on the conceptual side. We also tried, because also being a quantitative researcher, to look, okay, what type of data do we have to support this? So what type of data can we use for subjective experiences? Well, questionnaire data. So people, after having had a specific experience, are reporting what they have experienced. And so we were interested what type of data is around there. And we've now like published some articles about it and have a website with a database where we pulled out all of the quantitative data which is available in the literature to quantify systematically altered states of consciousness. So we call it the Altered States Database. So we did here, according to PRISMA standards, literature research about questionnaires are available to quantify altered states and then extract all of those data. So in the meantime, this is like such a table with an overview. There's from 22 substances and from 13 non-pharmacological techniques, overall more than or like almost 900 data sets in, where data sets means like one study with one set of subjects and one induction method and one dosage. And we all brought this together. We have this freely available on the Open Science Framework, so everybody can use it to make meta-analysis. And we've put such a website up, which is called the Altered States Database. And it's a little small, but like one can see on the landing page, it's asking you, what is it like to be on? And then you can choose like, okay, LSD or psilocybin or alcohol, and it will show you the available data across all studies which have been using particular questionnaires. And this allows a direct comparison then also across dosages, and it allows the comparison between how does LSD compare with psilocybin, compare with other induction methods. So it's an interactive website. You can try it out, asdb.info. We also were able to use this data to do dose-response relationship analysis. That's something that literature needed, particularly for clinical trials. You need to argue what dosage of LSD or psilocybin you want to give to a patient, with what type of experience to be expected. And we have done this for LSD and for psilocybin. For LSD, we also have such an interactive website up where you can use here such a ruler, and then you can say, look, okay, what effects can I expect if I take 100 micrograms of LSD? Purely for scientific purposes, because you need a bit of understanding of the underlying data and also of the dosage. So we don't believe that at the moment it's really useful for people who are seeking this information for like drugs. But at the moment it's like rather useful for really doing systematic comparisons across different states, and something that we are doing here, comparing psilocybin, so magic mushrooms, with LSD, and then one can make dose-response relationships and can analyze with what dosage can you expect what type of effects. Something which was never in a quantitative way available previously in the literature, and like now with this database, this is finally possible, and clinical trials are now using this database to argue for the dosage. So with this, we try to contribute on the data side to the question, well, what can we say about the dimensionality of the state space, what people have done by now. At the moment, one of the best tools is here, like this 11 factors, such a questionnaire that is very popular, used in altered states of consciousness research, while everybody is agreeing that it's not optimal. So this is not the whole scope of experiences, it's an approximation. And one big task and one big question in this consciousness, on the altered state of consciousness research, is how to extend this and how to go beyond this. So what we think would be a good idea to maybe do some citizen science and like ask the people who are having variable experiences to then develop new questionnaires and to develop this further. But here for today, I just want to present the current state of art, and that we are trying there to help to systematize the field a little bit so that all studies are getting properly comparable. For the matter of time, I would like to go to the second part of the presentation, was shorter than the first part, to give an example how in the laboratory one could use the induction of an altered state, which is maybe we had a critical comment in the first presentation about the question about psychedelics. It's like all over the brain and then all is happening and very confusing. I thought I couldn't agree better, couldn't agree more with this point, that there you don't just have hallucinations, you have so much other experiences. So it's maybe not a good technique in order to study hallucinations, because you don't know if what you're observing is a specific correlate of the hallucination, or if it's a correlate of an out-of-body experience, or you want to hug a tree. So it can be many things. Connectedness, you would call it. Same thing, I guess. So we were looking for techniques which are on the one hand not pharmacological, which can also induce for a short amount of time interesting hallucinations, and then actually compare it to the psychedelic data sets which are existing. What we were finding quite some years ago is flickering light. Stroboscopic light stimulation is quite interesting. So it has a long research history which goes back to Purkinje. So the person who was giving the name to the Purkinje cell, who was standing in front of the sun, was looking at the sun and was waving his hand. They were producing a flicker light stimulus, so a rhythmic input into the visual system, and notice I see so many more things than flickering. I see colors which are spectacular. I see like moving colors. I feel it's so fascinating what I see. This is so interesting. So stroboscopic light was also used by Hans Berger when developing EEG, and then it rather went into the arts scene. People in beat culture building stuff like turntables, lamps onto to somehow generated before LEDs were on the market, which were making it like much easier. So we thought this is quite an interesting model, because we didn't manage to get the sensory deprivation tank into the MRI scanner. Believe me, I tried, but it didn't work. So maybe with stroboscopic light, we can have a very well-controlled experimental condition where people experience hallucinations. So we were starting to explore a bit how can we find proper control conditions for such a situation. Because if we just give stroboscopic light and compare it against rest, then, well, in the one situation we have flicker light input, and the other one we have no input. Of course, there's going to be changes in the brain signals. So we were happy to find in the literature reports that it is mostly rhythmic stimulation which is giving these visual hallucinations. And if you make the flickering arrhythmic, then there's less of these hallucinations. So we thought this is a very good situation, because then we can have a control condition where we have the exact same amount of on light, off light times, and the same amount of stimuli, so the same amount of the retina is getting input and then switching off. But in the one situation, you have much more hallucinations than in the other situation, so it would be a fair comparison condition for an fMRI experiment. So we're bringing this to the scanner, just standard resting state fMRI. Not much to say about it. Pre and post scans and then rhythmic and arrhythmic stimulation. We validated the questions that we asked the people. Where you can see in red, in the rhythmic stimulation, you have a lot of hallucination. In the gray, you have half the stimulation, it was arrhythmic, and when there was no stimulation, you didn't have any visuals. So we chose here 10 Hz stimulation, as it somehow were peaks. So at around 10 Hz, you have the strongest amount of hallucination. So we were replicating this previous finding, and then in this fMRI study, we were able to contrast rhythmic versus arrhythmic. First, contrast with regards to activation, because we also had a small block sign included, different conditions on. So what do we see? Well, not so surprising, we see the visual system quite strongly activated by flicker versus rest. We also see the thalamus slightly, because well, this is the visual pathway. Now the interesting contrast is the second one, where we have the same amount of light coming to the brain. However, one times rhythmic, one times arrhythmic. In the rhythmic situation, we're having more hallucinations than in the other one, and we're finding a relatively specific pattern of activation in higher order visual regions, which somehow makes sense with regard to the nature of the hallucinations that you're having. That it's like colorful fractal structures which are having some shape, rarely semantics, but sometimes. And then we thought, because in the field, people are interested in thalamocortical interactions particularly, so excited about the talk which was there earlier, that how far can we use this with fMRI to investigate how the thalamus is interacting with the visual system. For the visual system, we took the Van Kastner atlas, the most common best atlas to map out different visual regions. And since a few years, the AAL3 atlas is giving a very good anatomically motivated parcellation also of the thalamus. We did quite some controls because the thalamus is small and wide as big voxels, that indeed we have different signals from different thalamic subsections, which allowed us to now test for specific interaction changes between the visual cortex and the thalamus. So here on the right-hand side, you see such a connectivity matrix. On the x-axis, you see the visual regions, and on the y-axis, you see the thalamic subregions. So you see already there's a quite distinct pattern of interaction between thalamus and visual cortex, but not surprising because you have the visual pathway, and somewhere here, of course, we see visual pathway, we see NGN increase in another study, it was like even stronger and like related nuclei. However, there's the strongest difference in connectivity change is not along the visual pathway, but is between visual regions and higher order thalamic nuclei. We heard a lot from Matthew Lackmo about higher order thalamic nuclei. And now, a drum roll for the contrast of rhythmic versus arrhythmic, because this is then the specific correlate of a visual hallucination, and it's quite specific. That's the interesting bit that we see here, and because we find quite selective increase in the connectivity between ventral anterior thalamic nuclei and higher order visual regions. Okay, what does it mean? So we assume I have to admit, while this is quite specific effect, and we replicated it, and now just like 2 weeks ago I heard from another group who are also replicating that it's quite selective, this increase. It is by now quite hard to interpret what it actually means. So there is one model, which is the cortical feedback loop model, where people had the suggestion that hallucinations are mostly resulting from an increase in connectivity from the LGN to the visual cortex. So that there's just like more input coming into the visual system, and the visual system cannot deal with it. This is not what we find. So this is maybe the most interesting bit, that our data clearly rejects this model. So the visual hallucinations does not seem to be related to this increase in bottom-up input. Just as a teaser, we compared it to the psychedelic data sets, same. Not yet in the literature, but also in the psychedelic data set, it's not this bottom-up driven signal. Instead, it seems to be this higher level interaction between higher order thalamic nuclei with higher order visual regions. So we are also not quite sure yet how to interpret and what to make out of it. Maybe also we are not these thalamic experts, but we tried some interpretation along with dendritic integration theory to say that it's maybe just like a strong interaction, like a strong driving input is arriving at the apical dendrite, and this is thereby making the cortex much more excitable, and thereby it is tending to give over interpretations, and this phenomena can come from. There's other hypotheses around which have more focus on entrainment, so on the rhythm and on standing waves which would occur in the visual cortex. However, we have this interesting finding of the interaction with the thalamus, and somehow it needs to be integrated, and maybe it's also a mechanism which is promoting entrainment effects, which might not work for all of the conditions, and is thereby here I just want to present it as an example how the systematic study of altered states could help to then elaborate in the field to find relevant neural correlates. We don't know if this is the relevant correlate of the hallucination, but at least we can somehow show that it's not the increased connectivity from the thalamus to the cortex, because we have a condition where this is clearly not the case. So much a bit of an overview. where I tried to motivate in this talk the induction of altered states of consciousness can, on the one hand, contribute to developing better ideas on what dimensions of consciousness we should look at when we study neural correlates of consciousness, and maybe just looking at the varieties and the plethora of altered experiences that people are reporting. This might be a good data source. It's studying phenomenology, and one can do this in a systematic way to then inspire laboratory experiments where you compare different situations, where you have in multiple situations hallucinations, and then try to identify what is the relevant neural correlate. Is it 5-HT2A in receptor information? No, it's not. It must be some computation mechanism, and this computation mechanism should be there in all of the conditions where you induce hallucinations. And thereby, I would like to motivate using those very interesting techniques which can be used under controlled laboratory and are much better than psychedelics, which are doing something all over the place, to then compare them to isolate the individual neural correlates of a particular altered state phenomena, and thereby in this field of empirical consciousness research, getting the spot, and maybe I should make it like bigger, the spot, because it's so important in this research, to clarify mechanisms which are then also having implications for clinical situations and can thereby be seen as basic research for clinically relevant symptoms. And with this, I would like to thank you.
Thank you very much, Timo. Do we have any questions?
Has any work been done in struggles to get applied in projects?
Yes, quite interesting. But recently, Marassa United did a study where she did the imaging of the visual cortex and was giving stroboscopic light stimulation also in similar frequency range. She did not record from the thalamus, though, because it was imaging technique by looking from the top of the cortex, and there she found evidence for something like standing waves. So that like some patterns of activity are emerging in the visual cortex when you are stimulating with rhythmic input, probably due to hardwired lateral inhibition within the visual cortex. There's also some mathematical models which are trying to formulate this, that just based on lateral inhibition, basically you would get such standing wave patterns. We will now, it should come out in the next phase of neuroscience and consciousness. The journal that we have is Andy Assess's group, a review article where we are reviewing these different models, and this is at the moment the best rolling work. And I did not fully cover the literature, but I'm not aware of good studies studying the interaction of thalamus and cortex. That would be something very exciting.
So the cell activity of the planet finding is so fascinating. One alternative hypothesis, as opposed to such matrix-style projections about visual cortex. I know for VA, there are bidirectional connections to hypothalamus. So I wonder if this is actually reflecting an overall state change in reality, something like this.
I did not particularly ask the people about it, but I would not expect it necessarily, because also in the control condition, you're having even a bit of an annoyance maybe of the arrhythmic stimulation. So I would not believe that it's like a major arousal effect, but it would be interesting to look at it. About the connectivity, I'm not so sure. We are a bit unsure about it. I mean, it could also be like, as we discussed earlier, like a side effect of the reticular nucleus, like projecting there, and then maybe the resolution is not appropriate that we have there. I'm happy about any interpretation and would be happy like this Max Schein's lab to like explore more if you guys are having more ideas how to interpret it, because now people replicated it, so we have to deal with it. It's not just us.
More questions?
I have more thanks a lot for this update on your research, and that's very exciting to see your results. So did I understand it correctly that you were looking at plasma connectivity during visual stimulation? You really touched on like comparing non-pharmacologically induced ASCs to pharmacologically induced ASCs during resting film MRI. But my question is like, to what extent is it confounded because of the induction method of non-pharmacological ASCs, because there's like rhythmic changes in luminance also that might stimulate the visual cortex in a very different way than if you're running a video scanner looking at a fixation course. So you also have these differences. So how do you want to compare these and disentangle differences?
Yeah, I believe all of the methods to induce such phenomena are having some confounds with them, like if it's arousal, if it's blood pressure, if it's like all of the wild effects that pharmacological methods are having. So I would believe we, at the moment, have to generate a few more data sets and then put them all together, maybe in a larger meta-analysis. So we have now, over the last year, collected quite some data sets. We have collected from London, from Zurich, LSD, psilocybin, ketamine, TMT, we have sleep data, we have deprivation data, we have flicker data. We have processed them according to standard fMRI resting state pipelines, and we are close to making fair comparisons between them. So the basic idea would be to just look for what do they have in common. And then I make across these data sets look like, okay, those where there's more hallucinations, there's more of a particular pattern in connectivity change as compared to where you have less hallucinations. And then all are coming with their own confounders. But like maybe in a bigger meta-analysis, one can then overcome those by seeing what they have in common and what they don't have in common. I also don't have a better suggestion for this, as it seems that all of these methods are hard to study and are coming with their very own confounders, where I would say maybe with such a quite controlled experiment with flicker light way better than like psychedelics. It's way hard to interpret what mechanism is related to what particular phenomenon.
So I was wondering what you think those studies can really tell us about the neuronal qualities of consciousness, because the way we're thinking about it is that consciousness itself is not really manipulated in those studies, which manipulate all the contents of consciousness, namely what people consciously experience.
There we have a quite different opinion.
So the way I think about these things is following Andrew's metaphor of the light and the room. The consciousness is the light, and then there are the contents of consciousness that are the objects in the room. What it seems to me you're doing here is that the light stays the same, you're just changing the objects. Namely, in one case, people experience a hallucination, they have an experience as of something. In the other case, they have an experience as of something else. But I don't really see any reason to think that consciousness is manipulated.
But I think here it's like a defining problem, right? Because you're basically just reducing consciousness to consciousness state, so how conscious you are, and the content. This is like two features of consciousness. There's like so much more basic underlying structures of consciousness which can be changed with earlier. I think it's a line with Laurie's awareness, like how much from there and like the content. So content is basically not so interesting here. There is, you will find 10, 20 other features that are alternate to consciousness. I don't see consciousness as a much higher dimensional phenomenon. In line with the Tim, this is Bain and Hoey paper, they're saying like, well, this is too simplified to have only basically the level of consciousness, and then content is like something else anyway, because it's just like a realization of like a phenomenon, but like not describing it as like how conscious you are, but with regards to what are you conscious, with regards to your self-reflection, with regards to that you're experiencing a sense of time, that you have continuity, and all of those. No, this is not what content. This is like an intrinsic part of the dimensions that consciousness is having, because it's too simple to reduce it to content.
You're conscious.
I mean, you're very much from the perception side and can reflect about something that sees something, and this is consciousness. I would not say that this is the consciousness, but I mean, defining what consciousness is maybe like beyond what we can do here. That's what I try to motivate in the first part of the presentation, that there are people have more varieties of consciousness, and thereby try to say it's higher dimensional and it's more features of consciousness that one should look at, which are all having their own correlate. And like Beethoven mechanism in global states, the local states, global is like the content, and global, however, is still having multiple dimensions, multiple features that can be changed. And there were just like, I guess, different views on how you want to define consciousness. And I believe that it's too simplistic to just have awareness for having one line on how conscious are.
Well, I don't even believe in levels of consciousness. I think it's just the light, it's either there or not. And then the rest is content. It's just, even if you have, something like a different feeling that the time is passing differently, that's a different content. If it's just the way things seem to you in experience. Okay? That's just the definition of content. The definition of content is the way things seem to you in experience.
Maybe there's other people direct advice there.
Yeah.
When you also have to be careful that you're not going into the full debate of what consciousness is.
This just seems like a semantic question, just moving then this whole separation of the dimensions into the contents. So in the contents of consciousness, you have different ways of separating them and defining them, different dimensions of contents and so on. So, I mean, I don't really see it from, it seems like.
I think that's a great summary, exactly. Like if you want to summarize all content, but it's still like the high dimensional content state, one can do this, I guess. There might be some of the dimensions for which it's not so easy to do it. Was Metzger also discussing quite some suggestions on those, and would also like rather go into some underlying things and separate the content from it. But like this one to do just we just like define it as features of content and spaces.
But it gives you different views on the neuronal correlates of consciousness.
That's the other one. That would have a bit like more basic and underlying dimension.
Timo, how about imagine in the further study, if there are three different conditions, the one is the gap between the onset are identical, of course, predictable, and the second condition, the gaps between onsets are not identical but predictable, and the third condition, the gaps between the onsets are not identical and not predictable. And this offer more information.
The minute specific reciprocity, which is in there, so like as soon as the experience in music, whatever, and you already learn reciprocity, and then you're having more or less of it. I don't know. Didn't see it in the literature, didn't see descriptions of it.
Yeah, also in the first two conditions, they're both predictable and maybe give more space for the feedback information.
Maybe it's a difference between by conscious reflection predictable. I mean, it's like 10 times per second, so it's like very fast. So you're not like consciously reflecting about, like you're predicting the next thing to happen, but in a melody or in something that is like a fixed sequence, you would probably reflect about it and then just like know what is coming. Maybe this is different mechanisms, but I would not be aware of it. Thank you. Great idea.
All right, let's have one last question. Who has a question they really want to ask? No one.
Just so, for example, the stroboscopic study, fMRI study. So how did you, talk about the dimensions of like phenomenology, how did you measure during the, like, whether there was altered perception of time, and was it like asking the subjects during a light flash, whether they were experiencing colors or not?
So one is typically doing it in retrospect to not interfere too much with the state. And we did in a previous study like a detailed assessment with different questionnaire tools. While there is a nice aspect of it is that you can control if you want to have such other features, and we wanted to focus mostly on the visuals, so that the people did not have much of other altered experiences, but mostly they were having the visuals. But you go through the experience and then fill in a 100-item questionnaire for the overall characterization of the state. and then one is taking a few of them out and it can also ask them live. So here in the MRI scanner, we were always after a session through the intercom, like asking them a few questions which they were making live.
All right, I think that's it. For the sake of time, let's thank our speaker again. I would also like to thank Katie Billet, who helped us out with lots of organizational stuff, and Daniela Zatis, who helped us with the whole organization process, getting slides and hotels for our speakers, and pictures and funding. So thank you to both of them. Also to the Department of Psychology and Education, who provided some funding. And now we're going to, you know, what we're going to do now.
Yes, now we're having a bit of time for everyone to grab something somewhere. And then from 6 o'clock on, you can gather in the P Cafe. If you don't know the P Cafe, then maybe talk with some of the students and like get your way guided. With the speakers, we're going to lunch, so you stay here. And in the P Cafe, you will find, if you arrive between 6 or to 7 o'clock, there's just an open fridge. Just like say that you're coming from this event. And then we all can hang out there until 10 o'clock to just have a bit of a exchange. There's no specific program planned for this, just like enjoying the rooftop, like now the weather is perfect with a cold drink. Looking very much forward to see you all there. Thank you very much.